Okay, so this is going to be a weird talk for me to give because we're going to talk about work in our lab, and it's going to look like it has nothing to do with each other, because that's how I run my lab. But the point is to give you a few examples of like how we've been trying to study social interactions, and not that this is the right way or the only way, but just to kind of inspire some ideas that may be useful. And then if we have time for discussion this afternoon, we'll continue on like what are the real challenges in like studying interactions and designing experiments. So this is kind of just the kind of inspire that discussion. Okay, so for me, this is how I see myself most of the time, just like staring at everybody and watching everyone and being very creepy and voyeuristic. When I was a kid, it was because I didn't really have any friends. So that's how it is. And now as an adult, it's just because I have no friends. So I just watch TV or whatever I can do. But always trying to figure out like people are nuts and like why do they act the way that they do? That's kind of been the thing. Like, why are they like good people? Because that was really surprising me for a long part of my life. Or like, why is this person like, doing something that seems like it's really hurting somebody else's feelings or something else that's against their goals? And so to summarize kind of the stuff that we do in my lab is roughly about what are the hidden motivations that are driving the things we can't see, but we can see behaviors, but we don't know what. Good. All right. So I learned during my PhD about this really niche part of economics called psychological game theory, where people try to model beliefs, and we can do from their emotions and many other things. And then also experimental economics, where you're actually trying to run experiments to test some of these theories. And one of the criteria, every field I found when you're kind of interacting with them, they all have like jargon that you don't understand, and they have these weird norms that you have no idea how they evolved, and they seem very foreign to you. So coming from like social psychology, like where everyone prides themselves on deception, if you wanted to work with an economist or collect data in an experimental economics lab, you were forbidden to ever use deception. So everything had to be incentive compatible and for real. So you didn't like screw up the subject base, but also to make sure that the things you were studying were kind of pure. And I remember in the beginning kind of bucking hard at this. I'm like, this is crazy. Why shouldn't this is like my life. I don't want anyone telling me what to do. So you're going to tell me a rule. I'm going to find a way to break it, or at least why you're wrong. But I've kind of grown to really appreciate this idea, and it's really extended just in the natural and ecological validity in general. And then my training is in clinical psychology, and specifically worked in behavioral medicine. And I was interested in somatization, so how manifestations of your beliefs and things in your internal states can manifest in your body. And I did a lot of like couples and family therapy in this context, so cancer, end of life care, stuff like that. So family therapy, systems therapy, and game theory are going to be sort of the things that influence the designs of these studies. So we can think of, obviously it's not actually a line and there's many more dimensions, but I feel like in psychology, we've prided ourselves a lot on trying to have a lot of experimental control where we can remove most of the external context to excise like this specific process with our experiment that we can presumably causally manipulate. And I think there's amazing work, and this is absolutely critical to do. But I think as a field, we've really come to prioritize that and not care as much about, is this actually an interesting question, or does it relate to our lives, or is it things that our brains have evolved to do? And if what we're doing now isn't really just me staring at Gabor patches, or me like recalling a list of words, or like describing how I'm feeling every second of the day when I can't have a day because I have to describe it, an experience sampling study, we're talking to each other, we're doing stuff, all of the social stuff, and all of like our perceptions and cognition and affect systems have evolved to function within this context, yet we rarely ever study it. So I think the ecological validity has obviously its limitations, but I think that needs to be brought more to the forefront, I think, in research. And when you're studying social interactions, I think one of the reasons historically, there's been fads over the last 100 years of where people were studying them, but it always drops off with the methods and measurement. So it's like, how can you actually do science if you can do it? And then, okay, well, let's prioritize doing science, but not actually studying the question we want. And that's, I think, what the problem with interaction research has been. So I think there's no way around this, and trying to do a dance or doing a series of studies to systematically get it is what's going to be key. And I just want to give you a few examples from work on our lab. And this is a weird talk because I'm going to talk about a question, so pretend like this is a research talk, but it's really, I'm going to focus just on the method or the design of it. So the first one is being a constant skeptic and spending like 10 years doing clinical training. I'm like, I don't even know if psychotherapy works, and I'm not sure how I can be convinced otherwise, but I have lots of hypotheses of other things that I'm doing. So I want to give you just a quick example of a study on there, and with very minimal setup. Psychotherapy is really interesting. And as just in general, when you think about medicine, we think about medicine now as this very scientific discipline where we're manipulating genes and molecules now with like COVID vaccines and all this stuff, which is incredible. But really the only thing constant in medicine over the last couple thousand years, if not further, is that it's basically this dance of between somebody that we think knows what they're talking about how to heal you, and you having a problem. So it's really just whether they actually know how to heal you or not doesn't really matter. It's our beliefs in them and our confidence in them that seems to be what's constant. And so there's a kind of a well-known book written by Jerome Frank where he talks about the ritual healing. So he kind of took an anthropological perspective where he went to all these different countries and cultures to study the shamans and the doctors and to see what they had in common. And he basically found in the ritual healing that there's always some type of like trusting relationship. There's like some version of a healing context environment. There's always like some plausible treatment rationale about the thing that's causing you to act a certain way or that's producing your symptoms. And there's a ritual that both people sort of buy into to treat this, whatever problem it is. And so I'd argue it wasn't really until, and this is shockingly late in discovering medicine, but until starting in the 40s when that was when the first double-blind clinical trial was actually done in the late 40s, early 50s. And it was in the US, the FDA didn't even require this until the late 70s, early 80s as being a requirement, which is pretty wild. So you think about all of the like placebo treatments, like eating feces and horns of unicorn and bloodletting, and all of this stuff that we've been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And there was never actually any controls to rule out expectations. And we know a lot about the patient's expectations, and this is in the form of placebos, but what we don't know is like how much do the doctor's beliefs about what they're doing, how much they influence it. So you might go to medical school for a long time, or you might go get a clinical psychology degree and spend all this time, and then it's like, of course, confirmation, whatever it is, of course, I know what I'm talking about because I have a PhD, right? But we don't actually know how much our beliefs influence it. So this was a study that was led by Andy Chen and Herschel Hans, who's now in med school, despite us trying to convince him otherwise. And so the idea is we wanted to study this way of where we can manipulate the doctor's beliefs to create this, to see if their beliefs manipulate the patient's outcomes. So in the context of a simulated clinical action. And so we created this fake cream called Thermidol, which acts on this trip channel, which is like your thermal receptors. And then we applied it to doctors so they could test to see if it works. And then we delivered thermal stimulation in the form of heat to create pain so they could experience and be conditioned to believe that the treatment worked. But it's just Vaseline. So there's two stages to this study. So participants come in, they're randomly assigned to roles. They're not real doctors or patients, but we dress them up. The doctors get trained and they on what to do and how to talk and introduce themselves and what the point of the study is and all that. And then we could do a kind of a traditional placebo conditioning study where we apply two different creams and they watch us mix in the Thermidol into one of them. And then we apply thermal stimulation to both sides. And then the computer controls that they get different temperatures in each one. So they see it, but they have a top down, but they also have the bottom up conditioning to believe that the treatment actually reduces the sensation of heat or the intensity of heat. Okay, so that's the belief induction. They get high temperatures and low temperatures and high temperatures with the thermidol, depending on what site it is. And this is just a manipulation check, but the doctors report when they're as expected that when we lower the heat, and that they attribute that to thermidol, and that increases their belief of how effective the treatment is. Okay, so this is how we can experimentally manipulate aspects of the two parts of the dyad and in this interaction. In the second phase, then, we're into how the doctor transmits these, or what the impact this might be on the patients. So we basically tell them they can't tell the patient, it's single blind, they know which treatment's which, but they can't tell the patient which ones are which. The patients, it's a sequence of trials where they get the same temperature, but it's on different sites depending on where they believe the control cream is versus the thermidol cream. And interestingly, the patients report feeling less pain, even though they're getting the exact same temperature when they're experiencing the thermidol condition relative to control. And their beliefs are increased that this is an effective treatment and the control isn't afterwards as well. So self-report, unfortunately, is a limitation of how we need to infer people's internal states. And there's so many ways we can introduce bias. And in fact, this effect is based on a really classic one by Robert Rosenthal on interpersonal expectancy effects. And he's shown that experimenter bias can really affect your empirical results. So Pygmalion study you might have heard about the teachers are told that their students were geniuses. And by the end, those who believed it, their test scores were actually like higher on standardized test scores. So finding objective ways to do this. I don't know what's happening here. Okay. And video games on the side, sorry. Got to make that money to feed my lab. Okay, so we also measured other objective markers, so like electrodermal activities. This is like skin conductance. And you can see that this is on the patients, that when the patients believe they're working the control cream, the temperatures are identical, they're having a larger autonomic arousal relative to the thermal condition, which is much more suppressed. So it's not just their self-report, they're also physiologically showing less indications of arousal. And then another way we've tried to study this more objectively is to look at to try to quantify the pain expression behaviors. And this we focus specifically on facial expression. So later in the week, when we go into nonverbal stuff, the whole thing again. Might have to give up on this. Okay. So we'll talk about some of the software we've developed to record objectively using computer vision models, facial expressions. And so this is the output of that software. And we use that to train linear models that are associated with how much the doctors experience pain. So this gives us kind of like Ashton was talking about decoders in the brain. This is like a decoder for facial expression. So we can apply that to new videos. So like the patients when they're experiencing the pain to see, does the model think that their facial expression behaviors are indicative of someone where they're receiving a higher temperature? So the model doesn't do great, but it is significant, explains some, maybe half the variance. And it's basically the expression, we can't fully visualize it easily because there's a lot of features. But it's essentially it's like learning a grimace face. And so when we apply the model now to the patient data, so this is completely out of sample, we find that the model thinks that when the patients are delivered the thermidol cream, or when the doctors believe they're delivering thermidol cream, the patients are showing less pain expression displays as well. So we're pretty excited about this idea because this is a way, if this really works, either with brains or other types of behavior like facial expressions, you might be able to bypass some of these self-report things in the future when you're trying to study interactions, which I think will be really important for moving towards more increasingly naturalistic designs. Interestingly, we can also apply the model to the doctors when the patients are receiving the pain. So this is also out of sample data because it's not trained on when the doctors are receiving pain. And the model also thinks that the doctors are exhibiting less pain facial expression behaviors. And so it could be that they're doing sympathy ones. It could be there could be a whole bunch of reasons why this is happening. But also the patients perceive the doctors to be more empathic when the doctors are delivering the thermidol cream on average too. So the doctors are definitely doing something different.
In terms of like bypassing self-report, do you think facial expressions are like manifestation of our beliefs, like a way to communicate to others, or do you think it's like a totally independent thing?
Yeah, I think
the real thing.
I think unfortunately both are probably true. I think there are things that we naturally do, they're expressive of our internal states, but we also have control over them. So we can up or down, modulate them. So like, if I'm not feeling well, when my wife's in the room, I'm feeling like the worst I've ever felt in my entire life, right? And then when she leaves, I'm like, it's not so bad. Like there's, maybe you guys did this when you were a kid too. And then she actually does the opposite. So when I'm in the room and she's not feeling well, she pretends like she is feeling well, because otherwise maybe I'm like, oh, well, we got to do something or whatever it is. I'm not sure what that says about our relationship. We've actually tried to do studies on this exact question, which we haven't gotten to work yet. But yeah. Okay. And then we've done a bunch of controls to rule out habituation and stuff like that. And I'm actually just going to skip this for time. But I want to show one more way that we try to, I think the most compelling demonstration of that the reviewers want us to add as a study, which is a within subject design. So it's basically an ABBA where they get the control, then the thermidol, and then we give them the control at the end, and you see a bouncing back. So it's not just purely habituation effect that is driving this behavior. And we replicate the extradermal activity finding as well. Okay, so what does this really mean? Yeah. Right. Right. So I think that not as being independent nor as a bug. I think that's like a feature of this approach, because in real life, I think that we are influencing each other, and maybe mimicry is a social thing, or maybe it's actually there's an emotional contagion. We don't really, how would we tell the difference? I don't know. That's like up to you guys to figure out, I think. But yeah, but which are the parts of that? And then the temporal dependencies might be another way to tease out which one causes it. And that's likely not stationary. It's like reversing back and forth too, about who's driving the behavior and the interaction. But I think those are all things you can measure. If the better the more refined your measurements in time and in the validity of it, I think will allow you to start being able to design experiments or analysis pipelines where you can test some of these hypotheses. But I think honestly, we're only kind of at the beginning of that stage right now, which is pessimistic me when I'm talking to my students is like, it'll never work. And optimistic when I'm talking to you guys is like, this is the most exciting time in the world because you get to be the ones that figure this out. Okay, so again, science, but not science. I'm gonna skip it. Well, I guess one thing I want to just point out is I said this about psychotherapy, but obviously we're not doing therapy, but it turns out psychotherapy, you can't do double-blind clinical trials because the therapist always has to know what treatment they're delivering. And there's been a bunch of really controversial papers over the last 40 years that have come out showing that at least 70% of the clinical trial research can be explained by which treatment the doctors actually think works. So if you went and got your PhD in cognitive behavioral therapy, you might think that psychodynamic therapy isn't very effective. And that's basically, if you look at who the authors are that are publishing and what their beliefs are, that explains all of their findings. So it's essentially like a meta interpersonal expectancy effect. But that's kind of, I think, our data are showing what's happening.
The ritual of healing slide, you had something about like, you need like a logical explanation for why the treatment's going to work. Do you think that's where this effect is playing in? It's like, if I have a background in something, I'm going to be able to explain it more clearly, or is it like some other independent placebo effect?
Yeah, so I think both of them. So I kind of think broadly, these are your beliefs about the likelihood of this person being to help me with these symptoms at this time. I think that's being influenced by all of the stuff you're talking about. Like the more medical it is, the more invasive the procedure. So why did deep brain stimulation, when you're going in and having your skull removed and being stimulated with no control, work really well? But then when you actually do a sham double blind, that it doesn't work anymore across several clinical trials, like that's a pretty invasive procedure for curing depression. And there's lots of things like that too. Same with surgery there's a lot of work on like knee surgeries and things like that, and elbow surgeries. Yeah, but I think that's all the exciting part of like, how do we build those beliefs? And is it about the person? Is it about the rationale itself? What are the things that contribute to your likelihood that this is going to work? Okay, and obviously there's the mechanisms of what are the doctors doing, what's happening in the model stuff, which is a really interesting part. But I think you have to have some ways to measure this stuff, which might be any of the things we're talking about, or synchrony, as probably talked about yesterday, to be able to then to test your hypothesis if your model's working well, because it's something we can never internally validate that well. Okay, other questions, or I'm just going to press ahead. Okay, so the next, I'm going to say study, but it's really a few studies, is focused on how do we connect with others? And this is outside of a clinical interaction. I mean, this might apply within a clinical interaction, but the studies have all been with mostly strangers. Okay, so one of the things when you're seeing the world the way I do, which is that everybody's kind of a penguin or insane, just being a fly on the wall all the time, is we never really know what's really happening, right? So I have some version of the story of what's happening here. They're all just like this crazy owner, what are they making us do? Like, how do we escape from this crazy place? But other people might have different interpretations of what's going on. And how do we know which one's right? Because there's no ground truth, obviously. So there's an interesting theory developed by Troy Higgins and colleagues called the shared reality theory. And according to shared reality theory, it goes that it states that people verify their subjective impressions about the external world by finding commonalities with others' inner states. So basically, if I'm not sure about what's going on, I might talk to other people in the room, and then other people might be like, oh yeah, I think the same thing. And so if a lot of people think the same thing, that's going to increase my confidence that that's the correct interpretation. And if a lot of people think something else, I'm just going to decrease my confidence. So that kind of makes sense. So we're just reducing epistemic uncertainty about the world. But interestingly, at the same time, the people who share my interpretation, I might be like, yeah, I like you a lot more because you're right. Because I might have a preference or affinity for my own interpretation. And that actually itself, the process of trying to validate or verify our interpretations of the world might simultaneously facilitate interactions and connection. So I think this is a really cool theory. The tests so far, I think in social psychology have been fairly weak. It's really driven a lot by like questionnaires after the fact of the experience, but I think the theory is really interesting. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more. So basically, this is just another review paper where we're trying to do it, but this is an example of how I think about it. So so imagine you're going to some art show, maybe at the Hood Museum, and you see a sculpture. You have some perception of the sculpture, that's transduced through your visual system. And those representations are likely similar to other people viewing the same thing. But the interpretation of things we can't see of it might be different. And so if you share the same interpretation so that you can kind of see hidden wise they're seeing the same thing, and you discuss it, you might feel more similar to that person or connected. Or if you're looking at the same thing and they're focusing or tending to different parts of it, like maybe the top or the bottom, then the theory says that you should have like a weaker connection or a weaker affinity for that person. And basically, so perception to connection, and there's some gobbledygook that happens in the middle that we don't really know. But the idea is eventually we'll be able to start building models of how this happens. Okay, so this is, so Ashton got to talk about his dissertation work. This was another project this was one of the first things we did when we started working together. So it took a couple years to run, and then it took 4 years to get published through 14 journals, I think. And I think we're in the 20 to 30 reviewers, I think we've had on this paper. So that doesn't really matter because all that matters is it's finally out. Ashton was like, what paper was that again? when they said it was accepted. Okay, so basically it was that we're like, let's try to find a way we can study social interactions and how can we actually do this in the lab? And so at least when Ashton and I are talking to each other or to other people, a lot of things we're talking about are about other people who often aren't even in that conversation. And so if like our whole like social world is built around talking about other people and learning about each other vicariously, like how come you can't find a single empirical paper that's actually tried to study this? There's endless supply of theories and armchair philosophizing about why do people gossip or what gossip is, but there's actually shockingly little empirical and almost zero behavior showing it. So this is one of the questions that Jeremy mentioned, and most people, including our reviewers, our first reviewer wrote a response that was longer than our actual paper about how it's not possible to empirically study gossip. So noted. That's set up to change, so that's why Ashton's still smiling today. Because he started early and was primed how miserable it is getting things published. So basically how the experiment went is he built a web app that had 6 people interacting simultaneously and they played a public goods game. So this is a game where people get some money, they invest it, and then that money gets evenly distributed back afterwards. So people can free ride and not put any money and expect others to, and then they get more money because they keep their initial endowment, or people can make the most amount of money by everybody cooperating. But in behavioral economics, the classic finding is that when you play this over multiple rounds, there's this huge unraveling effect where nobody wants to be a chump and get screwed by everyone else. So then everyone stops cooperating. And there's been a bunch of people trying to work on interventions to prevent that. So we're going to try to use this task as a way to study it, but introducing something that seems to be missing from the original studies, which is you can actually communicate with other people. So we'll allow them to talk. So the design of the experiment is there's 6 people, but across different conditions, the people have different roles in the experiment. So there's your immediate neighbors, there's your more distant neighbors, and then there's this remote neighbor who's someone you can directly communicate with. So you can in the form of like text chat. And this is private, so the other players can't see it. And when people are in some conditions, we make it so it's sparse information, where the world is much more uncertain. So you can only see your neighbor's behavior, you can't see anybody else's. And then we cross that with times when you can communicate with someone and make sense to kind of create a shared interpretation of what's going on. And that's your remote neighbor, but you actually never get to see your remote neighbor's behavior either. So you're just trusting of what they say is happening. Okay, so to kind of zoom out, this is increasingly naturalistic in the sense that this is a real interactions, but we've constrained how people talk. So it's through text-based chat. We've constrained how much allowed to chat. At this time, this was Twitter when I think it was 140 characters. They could send a couple messages back and forth each round. But then we create this experimental design where it's between group, where people play in these different kind of structures of what the social structure is, where they can communicate or not, crossed with if they have full information or sparse information. Okay, so first is if you just try to quantify or like describe like what do people even talk about in their chats, a lot of it now it'll be like amazing because everyone's using ChatGPT. But before, everybody back then in the 2000s or whatever we were when we were starting this, it was like most people are like, oh, you're playing with a real person. There's no way it's a real person. It's probably a bot. So it's like a lot of ways to try to suss that out. But interestingly, when you in the sparse information condition, that's when people start gossiping more. They're gossiping either way, right? A little bit, but the likelihood of them doing that increases when the information becomes more sparse, which is predicted by the shared reality theory also, but us ahead of time. Okay, so one of the things we try to show is how does communication or gossip really drive vicarious learning? So meaning, if you were to take information that's relevant for what's going on, so what are the behaviors that people you can't directly observe, and how are they influencing your behavior at the next trial, so your future behavior? So you shouldn't be able to see anything. It shouldn't actually have any influence because you can't directly see them. But when you can communicate, your partner who can see the distant neighbors might be telling you what they're doing, and that might be how you use that information to influence your behavior. So we tested that hypothesis and found that the weights or the influence of these people's behavior on yours when you can communicate relative to when you can't in the sparse information, this is the increase of the regression weight coefficients on it. So meaning there's increased influence that way, even though you can't directly see this. So it can only be communicated through the conversation. And if you're only getting information about other people's behavior that's being filtered through the lens of their eyes, so if they're like sensors in the world, then if there's any bias or stuff like that, that's likely to be propagated through as well. So we also looked at the end of the game, we asked them, how much did you like playing, or how much would you want to play with these players again? And so this is like a measure of affinity. And basically when you're allowed to communicate, you align with your preferences to the other group members with your communication partner more. So meaning you're kind of validating your way that the world works and seeing it the same way. And this is just a behavioral measure to show that that's true. Okay, and then the last thing is, does it facilitate social connection? So this is basically predicting how much you want to play or how much you liked your partner that you're communicating with based on how much your partner gave. So you always want to play with people the more money they give. That's in general. But when you can't see your partner, sorry, is this the right one? Distant neighbor. Sorry, this is of the people you can't observe. So when you can communicate to your communication partner, even though you can't directly see it, there's a much stronger relationship between their contribution of what the behavior in the game. So this is just another validation that the gossip is working or being propagated through communication. But when you're saying if you want to play with your neighbor again, you can't see what they're doing. So there's no relationship between their behavior or their behavior and your ratings because you couldn't see it. But then when you can communicate with them, it drops up a lot. So even if they give very little money, you still want to play with them again. So you just like this person, even if they're kind of a terrible player in the game and hurting you, which is really interesting as well. Okay, and the last thing is what happens in behavior in the game for cooperation. And basically what we find and this replicates some other people's work, is that the unraveling effect of, so how people, the mean contribution in the group across over time, it goes down when you can't communicate, but when you can't communicate, it basically prevents that unraveling essentially on average. And if you look at the data a little bit closer, it's actually like a bimodal distribution. So what's happening is there's a lot of people who actually don't just cooperate all the time. So the communication is actually preventing completely the unraveling. And there's other people where the unraveling still happens as that happens normally. But there's actually, the mean is deceptive because there's very few groups that actually show the mean behavior. It's really just this averaging these two modes of the distribution. Okay, so that's an example of how you can start adding behavior and adding in conversation. It's still not quite fully naturalistic, right? Because you're playing through this game, you're with strangers, you can only talk in like 140 characters. And so this is work that led by Emma Templeton, who is a shared grad student with myself and Talia. Talia mentioned just briefly yesterday. And this was basically work from her dissertation, where she was interested in what makes conversation good and just had people come in and record them both in video and audio of what they talked about. And I think there's a bunch of really interesting aspects of this experiment on the design side that I want to focus on. So first, if you're having this conversation, the unit becomes a dyad, not an individual. So how can we make inferences about a single individual as opposed to the dyad itself? And one thing that she did was use a round robin design. So each participant comes in and they're actually embedded within a group where they have conversations with other members of the group. And there's things, methods developed by people like David Kenney called the social relations model, which allows you then to identify the group effect, like this is just complicated around effect structures, or the individual effect, because you have the individual across many different dyads, so you can see how they vary or not. She also had some of the participants bring their close friends back. So these are all strangers, and these are like Dartmouth, undergrads, or usually freshmen, sophomores. And then a few of them brought back close friends where they also, she recorded data of them communicating as well. So afterwards, she had them fill out lots of questions about what their thoughts of the partner was. And one of them is like, how close did you feel, how connected, or how much do you enjoy talking with them? And this is like a PCA of all those questions together. And basically, there's a lot of individual variability. So sometimes some dyads really clicked and other ones didn't, like you can see here. And then some people just like, no one really liked talking to you. So they're rated way lower on average relative to everyone else. And some people, everybody liked talking to you. So there's individual variation and there's also dyadic variation in this data. So one of the things that Emma's done a lot is just exploring this data over the last 6 years is how do we visualize or see patterns that are happening? So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of that. So one is like, if you knowing nothing of what they're talking about and you just know who's talking and for when and how long, this is a way to visualize like basically turn lengths or how long each person's speaking. And so this one you can see people talk longer at a time. And then this one is one where they're just going back and forth much, much quicker. You can also look at the time in between the turns as a measure of gap length, which is really subtle. This is happening at about 150 milliseconds. So it's a very subtle and fast effect that we don't even really notice. So basically the question is, are there any, if you're just looking descriptively what's happening, is there any indication in behavior that's predicting connection? And one of the things that she's found lots of findings on this data so far, but one of the ones I'm focused on today is that if you look at the gap length or just the amount of time between one person responding to the other person, that predicts how connected participants feel to their partner across conversations, but also within conversations as well. So afterwards, you have people continuously rate how connected they felt with their partner at each moment in time and sees that the effects are also happening. So when the gap lengths vary within a conversation, that people are feeling more connected when the gap length shrinks. And specifically, it's not just on average of like when they respond to their partner, it's specifically how fast their partner responds to them. So in the moment, I might be very quick to responding to you. If you email me, like you might be lucky to get a response. And if you do, it might be months or years later because I'm terrible with email. So you can imagine that how fast I respond as a way of like how connected you feel to me. And a lot of people feel connected to me on email that they have reported numerous times. But that's essentially the effect that she found in behavior. Okay, so this is all correlational and looking at a data set and trying to describe it. And I think that's really important, especially when you're trying to get much more ecologically valid. But to say that it's the gap that drives this is a pretty large step. So how can we get to causal inferences on this? So one way that she tried to do this was she took the recordings of the conversations and then just basically manipulated what the gap length was between them. So she either made it shorter or made it longer, but the exact text or the exact recording is identical. So the speech rate is identical, all that other stuff. And she had third-party people rate how connected do you think these two people are. So importantly, these are the exact same conversations. The only thing that's different is the gap length. And the third-party participants perceive the connection as being higher when they're quickly responding to each other compared to when they're slower relative to control. So this is a way where you can kind of have naturalism and some experimental control. Of course, this is not the participants themselves. These are third-party observers. And I'm just going to skip this too, but she's working a lot on like, what do people talk about and is there structure to the conversations in general? Okay, so what about shared experiences? So we've done a bunch of work in our lab on this, like by watching TV shows, so including Friday Night Lights that Eshin talked about. And the one I'm going to focus on today is what about here at Mind when you're watching people give talks? So what's your shared experience like happening? So this is from this morning when Jeremy was speaking. And I get like a little too excited, but I don't want to interrupt everybody and share my thoughts to the world. So I might privately message people. So I look to my friends next to me and I see Mark and Eshin, and I'm like, oh, well, I really need to share some thoughts about what I'm seeing here. And to Mark, I'm like, oh, Jeremy, he's so amazing. He's hilarious. He's like, his results are amazing. His visualization's incredible. To Eshin, I might say, oh, Jeremy's hilarious. So I might be talking about different things to different people, and also the timestamps might be different. And so you can kind of see that there's this running commentary that's being privately shared. So it mirrors a lot to the gossip study that we were talking about earlier. But now we can measure in real time as like life is unfolding in front of us, which is a really cool way to do it. So this idea came from the pandemic when you guys might remember we were all stuck and looking to the world and interacting through Zoom. But at the same time, for some of us, we were having side conversations the entire time, which led to a lot of embarrassing gaps when you don't realize which channel or if it's private or not, and everyone else can read it and you're mortified. That happened to me regularly. So this was a project, this was Wasita's first project that she did, where she built a whole app and interface to study this effect. And so this title she has right now is Our Shared Experiences Blind, which I love. So basically the idea is she created Netflix Party, but we had full control over it, where she showed people episodes of Love is Blind, and she recruited people online, and they were basically paid to watch this and talk trash to each other. And she basically picked an episode that was very juicy in terms of like the drama that unfolds. So this guy, he's dating multiple people, and he basically he can't see, it's blind, so they don't know who they're talking to, but he thinks he's talking to someone else he's dating, and they had these whole other things that were different, and he starts saying all this stuff, and he was leading this woman to believe that they were very close, and he was like a good guy, and then he starts talking all this like kind of scummy stuff about, what are you wearing, and all this stuff, and she's like, who are you, and he doesn't know he's talking to the wrong person, so she gets disgusted and leaves, and he feels bad. But that's interesting, but what's really interesting is like, what are people doing? So first, everyone's like, this is garbage. Like, who watches this type of TV, right? But yet they're continuing to watch it. And this is basically this is like recapitulating the experiment and watching people, what they talk about and what they're sharing to other people. So what do you think the researchers are trying to find out here? Some of them are talking about the content itself. Some are like these meta things. They're about more generally about the experience, how people interact in a chat. And then other people are like, well, chat's the best part of the study. Like, I wouldn't do this, would be miserable if I just had to watch this by myself. So there's a lot of things going on, and it's really interesting. And so you can just to try to describe of what are people talking about and when. So regardless of what the message was, this is just the message density with respect to time across about over 16,000 chat messages. And you can see in the beginning, there's a lot of get to know you and trying to figure out are people bots or what's going on, what's the purpose of the experiment, where are you from, types of things. And then later there's events that happen. So I think somewhere maybe this one is where that gap happens, where the guy thinks he's talking to someone else, and then the messages start increasing more. So that was kind of also predicted, like when there's something that's worth gossiping about, people are going to want to start commenting and start feeling connected. So, and then you can kind of see these different sections of what people are, these are some example messages of what's happening. Okay, so this is really interesting. So now we can start studying real life stuff that's in some folding. It's still a little constrained because it's like these shared time locked experiences, but now we have timestamps and the content of what people are talking about, which is really difficult to get from an individual person. We can only guess what people are thinking about, but now we can actually just read their thoughts, or at least what they're willing to share with other people, which is really interesting. Okay, so what we find first is, can we replicate Emma's finding? And Emma did this in a real conversation where people are getting to know you. And this is in a text-based group chat on online. And it's not as pretty or clean of a thing, but we find the same relationship where people, the faster that someone responds to you in the chat, the more connected you feel to them afterwards in the study. Okay. That's, I think, really cool. And that's amazing. We have a psychology grad student here who's like also a web engineer and doing stuff and analyzing data. That's amazing. But the really, I think, innovative part is to really test the shared reality theory. What do you have to do? You have to manipulate reality, which turns out to be kind of hard in real life, and maintain some type of ecological validity. So Wasita had this really clever idea of like, well, why don't we just give people different versions of the movie? So they're watching, there's 4 people in the group watching. For the first 10 minutes, they watch the same thing. And then unbeknownst to them, she basically cuts or edits 2 different versions of the information so that 2 members of the group are getting different things than the other 2 members of the group. And then the last 10 minutes, they come back together and they're seeing the same thing again. And the idea being that if you can manipulate reality and this theory has any truth to it or validity, then we ought to be able to see changes in the connection, even if people aren't aware that the reality changed. And that's preliminarily what she found. This remains to be seen if we replicate it, but it's a really, really tiny effect. But on average, not controlling for anything else, just this fact that you see a different clip and nobody reports even noticing that there's a different clip, and we explicitly ask them as a manipulation check afterwards, you feel more connected with the person who's seeing the same version of the clip than the other people in your group. So it's controlling for the interactions itself. We haven't like zoomed in on what are people talking about and all that type of stuff yet, but just preliminary, it does look like there might be a small effect of this.
So what do they talk about?
Well, so they see the same ending. So to rule that part out. So it's only in the middle where they get information, and that actually changes your interpretation of some of the things that happen, because some people saw some information and other people saw other information about the relationship. Yeah, so it changes the context of how people are interpreting the later part. Yeah. It's bidirectional. That's right. Yeah. And analyzing it, not the dyad level, but just the individual levels if they were in the same group. So fun.
It's not like you do need to manipulate. Also, this would just be to introduce the time delay.
Right.
Force people to.
Yeah. So that's another thing we really want to run. And so to do Emma's experiment, but actually have a causal manipulation, can we add a time delay in the gaps of how it happens? That's hard to do. We could do it on Zoom. It's really hard to do in real life. Unless we have like microphones and changing things, but on this chat thing, it's trivial. You just add like a 20-30 millisecond thing, and you're actually changing the nature of the interaction itself to see the impact on the individuals and relationships. So that's we haven't done that yet, but that's in the works to do that exact study. But the idea is like, this is not like, I mean, everyone's done this. Like we talk trash on Slack or text all the time. We like watch things together. All these different things are happening, but it's like, can we find ways to where we can leverage that and add in manipulation so we can causally understand or manipulate the system to see what's going on, to understand how it works. And this, I'm not saying is the end. I think this is really just the beginning, but this is just one example I want to give of how we're trying to do that a little bit in our lab. Okay, so this is just a taste of stuff we're doing, but really focused on how we can have some control, but also some naturalism in our experiments with interactions. And so with that, I just want to thank all the people who did the work in our funding agencies. And hopefully this will kind of inspire some discussions at lunch and throughout the afternoon and through the week too of designs. And we can revisit more formally discussing some of the issues and hard parts about studying interactions. Thanks. And then we can do a couple questions you want, but otherwise we can just like go and eat too. And get out of this room. Yeah, and you can plenty of time, but not in action to me, ask Wasita or ask Emma, ask Ashin about some of this work too. Thanks.